Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for another live conversation, our Support is Sexy live chats. Today, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Adia Gooden, and I'm going to tell you what she's doing here with us, what she's going to share with us. And you're going to want to make sure to tune in or listen closely because we're going to talk about Black women and therapy and how to find the right therapist for you. All right, so we're going to go through that. I'm going to tell you more about her and just the basis of our conversation today and what some of the questions are that we're going to go through. So, according to the CDC, due to prolonged stress, Black women have a life expectancy of 3 years less than their white counterparts. And a study published in the National Center for Biotechnology Information cites that Black women experience accelerated biological aging in response to repeated or prolonged adaptation to stress, which makes us more susceptible to chronic illness. Now, to survive, Black women have developed what's known as high effort coping, quote unquote, in order to push through. And I know y'all know about that. Pushing through is something we often talk about, right? I'm going to push through. I'm going to keep it moving. I'm going to keep it all different versions of that. But pushing through and putting up a front as the strong one, which is something I talk about in my book, Get Over I Got It, is literally killing us. So today, we're just going to tell you, sis, maybe you should talk to someone. So today I'm excited again to welcome Dr. Adia Gooden to help guide us through the process of finding the right therapist who's a good fit for you. And Dr. Gooden is a Chicago-based clinical psychologist who offers online courses that help people develop healthy relationships with themselves and embrace unconditional self-worth. She is also a speaker who talks about self-worth, imposter syndrome, and Black women and mental health. And we're going to go through several questions. You know, y'all know I always have all the questions. We're going to go through several of the questions that I think are important. She's going to answer those questions for us. But please, if you're watching this, either now, live, or later on, please leave your comments, ask your questions. We're just going to have an honest conversation here, and she will share with us as much as she can. So, without further ado, Dr. Adia, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Elaine. Happy to be here talking with you today.
Excellent. So, my first question for you actually, I want to ask a little bit about you, which I didn't list as one of our questions here, but what made you want to pursue a career in the space of psychology?
Yeah, it's a good question. I sort of always say that there are kind of two answers that are both true. So one is that I've always been interested in people. So since I was a kid, I've always been curious about people, interested in people. I always liked people. I'm a people person. I'm an extrovert. I like to be around people. I like to understand people. And so that's always been true for me. And I've always been interested in helping people. So that has been true for me since I was a kid. And then to add to that, both of my parents are actually clinical psychologists. So I grew up witnessing two clinical psychologists navigating their careers. And, I saw my parents really enjoy what they did and the sort of flexibility that comes with being a clinical psychologist. So they were both sort of professors at the graduate level, and they saw clients, and they were able to do a number of different things. And so the combination of me being curious and interested in people and seeing my parents have really fulfilling careers as clinical psychologists definitely pointed me in that direction, and it's been a wonderful fit for me.
What would you say is something that you love most about the work that you do today? Whether it's the practice of psychology or also, I know you have online courses and your focus is really on self worth and help letting us know that our self worth is tied to our ability to ask for and accept support, which I'm all about. But what is it for you that really drives you today?
I think it's just witnessing the transformation that people go through, right? So whether it's an individual client I'm working with or somebody who, has participated in my course, like seeing people go from a place where they feel very stuck, um, you know, self-critical, not feeling good about themselves, not feeling like they're really living life on their own terms or doing what they want to do in their life, kind of hiding to a place where they're pursuing their dreams, where they're, experiencing love in a really fulfilling way, where they're just like showing up and shining in the world. Like that is to me the most beautiful thing. And if I want to help as many people as possible have that transition, because I think it is so easy for us, and I think this is especially true for Black women, to get into survival mode and to feel like I'm just surviving. I just got to make it through the day. I got to make it through the week, right? There's this meme or post that's been going around Instagram a lot. It's like adulthood is like, it'll be less busy next week until you die, right? Like, and there's this sort
Right.
of this sense of like, okay, like I'm muddling through. And I just don't think that that's what life is supposed to be about. Certainly, we'll have hard times, we'll have challenges, but I really want to help people live fully, live boldly, live on their own terms, and know that they're worthy. And when I see people make that sort of transformation, it's incredibly exciting and energizing for me.
Why do you think, especially as Black women, but a lot of us for different reasons, but speaking as Black women, what do you feel like is usually the barrier for us in getting help or support or talking to someone there, especially a therapist? We're not talking about, there's places of faith or houses of worship and talking to your friends. Those are all support, can be supportive too, but really saying, sis, maybe you should talk to someone. What sometimes stops us?
Well, I think there are a lot of things. I mean, there's certainly stigma, which I think is fading, right? The stigma around seeking mental health support is very different than it was 5 years ago and certainly 10 years ago. And so I think more and more Black women, Black people are recognizing, okay, therapy is not just for quote unquote crazy people. It's not just if you're just totally falling apart. It can also be for me. And I think that's certainly been helped by the celebrities, right? The Black celebrities who have sort of come out and said, I go to therapy, I went to therapy, you should go to therapy. And so that's really normalized it. But I think so many of us Black women are socialized into the strong Black woman persona, the I've got this, right? Sort of
Mm-hmm.
the handle everything without any help. And many of us witnessed our mothers and grandmothers, our aunts do this, right? Survive, push through. And maybe they did have depression. Maybe they were struggling with extreme stress. And often the way that would manifest and be talked about is maybe there's cancer, maybe there's heart problems, high blood pressure, diabetes, right? So there might be a manifestation of physical health symptoms, right? People just feeling tired, getting worn down, worn out, but there wasn't often a model for I'm going to take care of myself. I'm going to put up boundaries and say, no, I can't do that for you. I need to take care of myself. There was a always giving, always showing up, always self-sacrifice. And I think that became a model for so many of us Black women as the way you are supposed to be and live. In some ways, to be worthy, to be good enough, to, honor your foreparents, right? But there hasn't often been a model for taking care of yourself, taking time out, setting boundaries, saying no, that sort of thing.
Beautiful, beautifully. I think that's so on point. And Yolanda, hi, Yolanda. Yolanda says, yes, ma'am, preach. So you're on to something. Thank you, Yolanda. Let us know if you have any questions. So speaking of, you mentioned within that sharing about self-worth, and I know that's part of what you focus on in your work. So what would you say is the connection between self-worth and our willingness or unwillingness to ask for and receive support?
Yeah, well, I think there's kind of two main things. So, one is if we feel that not needing help makes us worthy, right? Like if we feel like, well, the way the way I prove my worth is that I do everything myself and I don't need anybody to help me, then asking for help is a threat to your sense of worthiness, right? And you sort of will push yourself to the limit until either you can't do anything but ask for help or you just fall apart, right? And so that
Mm-hmm.
can be one end. The other end of the maybe not end of the spectrum, but the other thing that I see a lot is people not feeling worthy of help. So people feeling like, I don't want to waste your time, I don't want to take your time, I don't want to take someone else's spot, I'm not sure if I'm that bad, I don't know if I deserve investing in myself, right? Am I worthy of investing my time, my energy, and my money in my own self-care, in my own, taking care of myself? So that can be another thing that keeps people from asking for the help that they deserve.
I think especially too, and I don't want to project this on anyone. So I'll say I've been there where this sort of you buy into, whether you're conscious of it or not, this idea that doing yourself means that you're better in some way. Doing the things by yourself
Mm,
or handling it on your own or figuring it out on your own, or the feeling of, well, I should know this already, whether that's something that is
mhm.
having to do with you needing help, or something that you might need help with, therapy wise, or something like at work or a project, or this I know I've pushed through, again, that phrase, something on my own. And I'm like, I could have just gotten help for that and probably done it in half the time. But there was something there that made me believe, but to do it yourself. And I always like to acknowledge, I don't know if you feel like this, Dr. Adia, I try to acknowledge too, like, there are societal reasons that we might feel like, especially as Black women and women of color, getting paid less than white women and certainly white men, and microaggressions at work. And there are things, we're not going to blame those things, but we want to acknowledge there might be reasons that you have some fear about saying, especially in a career setting, I don't know how to do this, I'm uncertain about this, or I need some help. That said, though, what you talked about earlier, you don't want to get to the point where you're so stressed that it's manifesting in all these other unhealthy ways because you're afraid to ask for help. But I have been there where there's a reason that I think, well, doing it myself will prove fill in the blank, when really maybe it'll prove it, but it might also prove to be dangerous for you, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is important to acknowledge the societal things, right? If you feel like you're have to fight stereotypes, and there are stereotypes that Black women are incompetent, that Black women are lazy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you feel like you have to fight those stereotypes, and you worry that if I ask for help, or if I say I don't know how to do this, people are immediately going to see, yes, say, see, you
Mm-hmm.
Black women don't know how to do, you don't know how to do this,
Right.
you don't want to do this, right? And so that pressure to disprove those stereotypes can keep us from feeling like it's even okay to ask for help, like there's even any room, because so often in professional settings, especially predominantly white professional settings, we feel like we've got to do everything perfectly in order to prove that we deserve to be there. And in order to be recognized, I think many, many Black women have the experience of working very hard and being under recognized and underappreciated for everything that you're doing. And
Mm-hmm.
that can lead you to feel like there's no room, there's no margin to ask for help or to say you don't know how to do something.
How does asking for help or receiving help reaffirm our self worth?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So I think, a big piece of helping people to embrace their unconditional self worth is helping people to know that even at their lowest moments, they're
Mm-hmm.
still worthy, right? Not just when you're flying high and achieving a lot of things and doing all this impressive stuff with the world, but also at the hardest points in your life, when you've made a
Mm-hmm.
big mistake, or you've had a failure, or you're really struggling, that you're still worthy. And if you can reach out and allow someone to be there for and with you in those moments, it is a reminder that you're deserving of love and care, even when you're having a hard time, right? And that
Mm-hmm.
helps you connect to the fact that I'm not just worthy when I'm achieving, I'm also worthy in these other moments. And I'm going to allow someone to remind me of that worthiness, because I think when we're having a really hard time, it can be the hard time to access our sense of worthiness. But having support from other people, receiving reminders, whether it's from a therapist or a friend or a family member, with somebody who says, I'm here for you, I'm here with you, I'm not leaving you, I love you, this mistake does not define you, right?
Yes.
That can remind us, okay, even in this moment, even in the pain I'm dealing with, even in the frustration, even in all of that, I am still worthy of love and care. And that can be really powerful.
I got goosebumps from this mistake does not define you. I don't know if anybody else felt that as deeply as I did. Yolanda says amen. So Yolanda felt what you were
Mm.
saying too. Yolanda, please let us know if you have any questions. And anyone else, if you have questions as you're watching this live or later, we're talking to Dr. Adia Gooden from Chicago, who's a licensed clinical psychologist. And she's talking to us about self-worth, how our self-worth reaffirms, or how therapy and support can reaffirm our self-worth, I should say. And now we're going to get into some questions about, okay, if you're convinced now that you can talk to someone, or you should talk to someone, or you want to explore even, right, talking to someone, how do we find the right therapist? So, Dr. Adia, what should I look
Yeah, I
for
think
when I'm looking for a
yeah, it's a
therapist?
really good question. So I think it's useful to remember that therapists are people too. And just like when you're dating, there could be a perfectly good person that you go on a date with who isn't the right fit for you.
Mhm.
And usually, if we're going about dating in a proactive and healthy way, we don't go on one date with someone that we're like, nah, not a good fit, and say, well, it's not going to work. I'm never dating again. Never going to. That can happen with therapy, right? Because there can be the expectation that every therapist should be a good fit. And if I meet with one therapist and they're not a good fit, I'm going to give up on therapy.
Mhm.
So obviously, therapy can be a very vulnerable experience, which is why people feel more sensitive about it. But I just from the start want to encourage people to give themselves time to find the person with the right fit and to know that it may not be the first person you meet with or talk with. And that's okay because every therapist is going to have a little bit of a different style. There are some sort of classes and ways we generally think about therapy, ways we work, and we can talk a little bit about that. But my personality and my way of doing therapy is going to be different than one of my colleagues, right? And so just to remember that a big piece of finding the right therapist is finding someone who feels like they are the right fit, right? You feel like you're understood. You feel there's a connection, there's a gelling there, right? So that's one piece. I think it's important, especially for Black women, to look for therapists who have, some culturally responsive practice, cultural competency training, right? So maybe you're looking for another Black therapist, right? And then there's some shared identity. But unfortunately, there are not enough Black therapists for the number of Black women who want therapy, right? And so part of what we need is we need more therapists to really understand what is happening for Black women in order to be culturally responsive and provide that service. So I'm actually wrapping up co-authoring a book with a friend and colleague, which is about just that. It's about educating therapists on the mental health experiences, the life experiences of Black women, and talking about what do Black women need in therapy that will support them in healing and thriving. And so that, I've done trainings on that and, co-authoring a book on that. And so I think that there are more and more therapists who are culturally competent, even if they're not Black. So to remember, it's okay to prioritize a Black therapist, but to know that if you can't find one in your area, it's still possible to ask some questions like, what is your training and experience with cultural competency looked like? What is your experience and training with working with Black women been like or looked like? And I encourage you to ask it in these sort of open-ended ways versus, are you a culturally competent therapist? Because many therapists are just going to say yes. But what you want to do is hear like, oh yeah, I've gone through number of trainings around working with people of color, around exploring my own identity, maybe as a white therapist, around blah, blah, blah. I've done training specifically around working with Black people, right? You want to hear what are the nuances of their answer. If they just say I've done 1 hour training, it's probably not enough, right?
Mhm.
If you ask, what are your experience working with Black women in therapy or with people of color, right? If they say, oh, I had one client 10 years ago, that's probably, you know what I mean? They probably haven't had enough experience, but if they say, I've had a number of clients, I feel like we've developed a relationship. So you want to sort of ask open-ended questions that allow you to see, okay, how is this person responding? And how do you feel about their response, right? So that's one way to explore. Another thing to look for, like I mentioned, is just, do you feel comfortable? Do you feel heard? Do you feel seen, right? Wanting to feel comfortable in the space, because this is a vulnerable space and you don't want to feel like you have to be on edge. You may feel that way in the beginning, but over time you should feel more comfortable. Those are some initial things you could look for.
Fantastic. I love that. And I want to make sure not to forget, we're going to invite you back when your book comes out. We absolutely want to make sure you do that. So know that invitation is there. I know that's going to be powerful. Also, I think it's so important, and thank you for this, for sharing that it's not just about, of course, it would be wonderful if, Black women who were looking for Black women therapists could find one in their area or in their insurance plan. Or there are a lot of different barriers for some of us for finding, that particular therapist who might be a Black woman. That's wonderful if you can, if that's what you want. But I think your advice also to ask questions of, I would say, would you say any therapist, whether she's a Black woman or not? I have a coach
Mhm.
actually who's a white woman, Margot, who I've worked with for many years, but I feel comfortable talking to her about things that I go through as a Black woman. She might not be able to relate intimately, but she understands and we can have conversations and I feel comfortable. So I think your question is about core competency and training around that, not just
Mhm.
like, people say, well, I have Black friends, not that a therapist would say that, or I have some Black clients. Even that, I would say isn't necessarily, it's sort of like, but do you have training in this space, or what is your experience in this space? So just, I hope that gives everyone a little bit of additional hope, or having some language around, okay, if I can't find a Black woman therapist, or I don't think that's necessarily what I want, need, etc., these are some questions I can use to ask to get the conversation going. And I also think it lets the therapist know this is what this person really is looking for. Maybe they can
Mhm.
refer you to someone else who does have that. So I'm glad you shared that with us.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Excellent.
My therapist I saw her probably for 4 years, was a white woman. And, I don't know that I knew to ask all these questions at the time, but some of the signals were that she had books on her shelf about Black women.
Mm.
And this
Hmm.
was like, probably like 10 years ago. Right. And so there were signs that I felt like, okay, right. This book didn't just magically appear after we started doing therapy, but like, she had already had sort of an interest and in reading and learning and understanding. And so there are also other things that you could sort of look for. If it's a private practice group, are all the therapists in the private practice white, or are there some people of color, such that there may be more nuanced questions and conversations, and this person might be able to have consultation from somebody who's a person of color or a Black woman, right? So there's some other, you can look at the pictures on the website, you can do sort of your investigation in a way that hopefully helps you feel more comfortable.
I know there's been a lot of conversation lately, or at least the conversations I've had or heard people have about racial trauma and understanding racial trauma, especially in the space of psychology and psychotherapy. Is that something that's important for us to ask the therapists we speak to about, or is that also included in the core competency that you mentioned? Is racial trauma or microaggressions and all these other things that a lot of Black women experience, just again being part of society, is it important for us to know if our therapist has experience with that as well?
Yeah, I think that is a really good question. I think especially if that feels like a primary thing that you want to talk about. Now, for some Black women, that may not be the primary thing that they want to talk about. But if talking about the challenges that you're experiencing on the job, the microaggressions, the racial trauma, if that feels very primary, then certainly, asking about what's your experience or understanding about racial trauma, about how it works, about how to cope with it, those are things. Because somebody may have had cultural competency training but may not totally understand racial trauma and how it works and how it impacts somebody on a day-to-day level. And so asking that question, I think, is really important. And then I think also asking of yourself, right? Because if you're in a
Mhm.
predominantly white workspace and a lot of what you want to talk about is white people treating you poorly, you also have to think about, am I comfortable talking to a white therapist about this? Right. And maybe another person of color would work, even if they're not Black, but they're also made like, you don't want to feel like, even if the person is like, I, have a lot of training, I'm great. If you feel a hesitancy to be totally open about what you're experiencing, that's going to get in the way of you really being able to open up and get what you need from the therapy.
Would you say too, I think something you just mentioned is important for us to talk about. Are there questions that we should ask ourselves before we even start to look for a therapist? So for example, one question might be, what are, even if I don't know exactly what my needs are. So for example, I mentioned Margot, my business coach. She has a psychology background. She's been a psychologist for many years. But for me, I call her a business therapist, because as much as I talk about my business as an
Mhm.
entrepreneur, there's a lot of psychology and other things, and she helps me with life stuff too. But for me, what I needed in the beginning, I didn't even think about the therapy part of it. It was about the business and the stress of the business and making more money. And, this was a few years ago and that kind of thing. So I had to ask myself those questions, or what was the priority or primary thing, as you said, that I felt like I was struggling with at the time. Now, as time went on, other things were revealed. But is that something we should also sort of consider and reflect on when we're deciding, okay, maybe I should talk to someone, right? I'm at that point. And then what are the things that I think, at least at this time, are the primary concerns for me? Because that could judge not even based black or white. That could be the person's experience or the therapist's background and those kind of things.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a good question to ask. Like, kind of how do you want to use the space, right? Some
Right.
people go into therapy and they want to vent and they want a space to just process, right? And they want more of an open ended space where they can just talk through everything that they're going through. There's some people who want strategies, right? Who are like, I
Mm-hmm.
want to talk about how to cope with this. I want to talk about how to change my thinking or change my behavior, right? There's other people who, and some of you could want more than one of these things, but I'm just sort of separating
Right.
it.
Right.
You could want to talk about, trauma, right? And process and work through and heal trauma. You could want to talk about your family and how family dynamics have impacted you. And it is really helpful to know this is the primary reason I want to use this space, because different therapists have different approaches, right? So all the things that I just described, different therapists have approaches that sort of work best with those things, right? So if somebody is, let's say, a cognitive behavioral therapist, right? CBT is what it's called in shorthand. They're going to be giving you strategies. They're probably going to be giving you worksheets and homework that are about recognizing your thoughts, changing your thoughts, recognizing your behaviors, changing your behavior. So it's more structured, it's more active. There are humanistic, client-centered therapists who are just really going to give you an open holding space, right? The core guiding principle is unconditional positive regard. So they're there for you. They give you the space. There's not a lot of interpretation. There's not a lot of strategy, right? And then there's therapists who are really expertly trained in processing and treating trauma. There's therapists who focus on what happened in your early life with your family and how does that affect you now. And so a lot of therapists combine these approaches. So you can, right, there's some therapists who kind of do one approach and many therapists combine them. But, having a sense of this is how I want to use this space is useful, because then you can look for a therapist whose specialty, right? If you want to focus on trauma, look for a therapist who says their specialty is trauma, right? And then you can ask them, how do you help people heal from trauma? If you want to focus on your family of origin, like, how, look for a therapist who can help you do that and ask that therapist about that. The other reason it's helpful is, really most therapists have the client guide the work, right? And so it's about, what are
Mm.
your goals? How do you want to use this space? What do you want to get to? And so I think sometimes clients expect that it's going to be more like a physician patient relationship where you kind of go in and it's like, okay, take this, take this, take this, right? Like a little assessment, and then I'm going to just tell you what to do. Versus therapy is collaborative and it's around, okay, well, how do you want to use the space, right? The way I start my sessions most days, most times is, where would you like to start today?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so it's really led by the client. And sometimes that can be frustrating if you're expecting someone else to tell you what you need to do and what you know what I mean, what you should be doing. But if you come in with I want to work on this or I want to work through this, then that really helps to set the stage and guide the therapy.
I love that. It's so funny. I sort of received that as I'm not a psychologist yet. Dr. D is going to work with me on that. But just as a coach and working with women and saying, so where do you want to start today, or what's new, or versions of what's going on? And I realize for me, that's helpful when I go to my coach. I call it a Margot list. I have a list of things that I keep from week to week of this is what's going on, or this is what's happening. I do a celebration. I have a personal part, and then I have a part about business. And it just helps me sort of keep track of things that were going on during the week, things I want to talk about. Something could happen last Tuesday that I might not remember to talk about. But just
Mhm.
because, as you said, she holds that sort of space of where would you like to start today? It doesn't feel like, and again, this is what works for me. For other people, an assignment or a worksheet or something might work, something specific for, okay, next week we're going to talk about this. For me, I need to come in like, this is what's going on, or this is what's going on, or whatever kind of version of that needs to
Mhm.
be there. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Yolanda said, awesome support. Thank you. I use CBT for my clients. Oh, Yolanda, let us know. Are you a psychologist also? And then she said, that's confirmation. I guess what you're sharing, what CBT, people who use the CBT method use. Yes, employ. Okay, so oh, I have so many questions. All right. So I want to ask, I just had all these questions. Right as you speak, I think of other questions. I want to know, how do I know when it's time to change my therapist? Maybe it's
Mm.
either because it's not working, or do you feel like sometimes the client gets to the point where they sort of graduate, for lack of a better word, or take a break? I know I of psychology clients of mine who I work with who say, this person worked with me for this amount of time, then they took a break, then they came back. Is that okay for us to do that? And how do we know when it might be time to reassess?
Yeah. So I think, if it might be time to change therapists if you're feeling uncomfortable, if you're feeling misunderstood, if you're feeling like you're just it's not working, right? Like you're not being able to use the therapy in the way you want. Your goals you're trying to get to you're not moving in that direction. I really encourage people to talk to their therapists about their concern with the therapy. We know that this is a hard thing to
Mm.
do. Therapy is such a unique space. I welcome feedback from my clients, right? And most therapists will, because part of the piece of therapy that is sort of unusual is that it's not just about what you're talking about or the strategies, it's also about the relationship. And there's this opportunity within the therapeutic relationship to talk about the dynamic, to talk about the process of what's happening between you and me. And the beauty of that is that we rarely get to talk to people that we're in relationship with about the dynamic between us. But in therapy, we could talk about it, right? And it could be saying, you know, I noticed that I feel like I said my goal was this, and you keep pulling me back to talk about that, right? And that doesn't feel helpful, right? And then you can see, does the therapist might say, oh, the reason I'm pulling you to talk about that is because I think that that's an underlying issue for this thing, right? And let me help you understand the connections. Or they might say, I apologize, let me recenter, and they might, regroup, right? And so part of what we want to do is we want to practice how we want to engage in relationships with a therapy, which is to give feedback, to give people an opportunity to change. And then if it's like, okay, it's still not working, then you can say, I'll go somewhere else, and that's fine. So I think if you feel stuck, if you feel it's unhelpful, you don't feel you're moving, you don't feel misunderstood, that's a good time to shift therapists. I'm not a believer that people should be in therapy forever. I believe that you should graduate from therapy. My goal as a therapist is to get people to a point where they no longer need me. And so I think if you're in a space where you don't really have anything to talk about, right? You're coming to session week after week and you're kind of like, things are fine. Things are fine. I don't have anything to talk about. Things are fine. That may be a sign that you're done for now, right?
For
And
now, right.
usually it doesn't have to be I'm done forever. It can be I'm done for now, right? I'm going to take a break and I will revisit it and I will return if I need it again. And that's fine, right? I don't believe that people just need to be in therapy for the rest of their lives. certainly some people do years and years and years of therapy, and that's beneficial, but I don't think that that's necessary for everyone. I also tend to be a more goal action oriented therapist. So that's also aligned with my style. But I think it's fine to have a conversation with your therapist about, I'm thinking that I might not need this space right now. What do you think? Right. And to talk about that. Right. And the therapist may say, yeah, you've been doing so well. That's great. We can take a break. And they also might say, it feels like there's this issue that we haven't gotten to, that we keep avoiding. And I wonder if we could spend some time working on that, right? Because the other thing, sometimes what people do is they use therapy for a crisis. And then when they're not in crisis, they sort of check out of therapy. But you can only do so much work in a crisis. In a crisis, you're usually fixing, wrapping up, put the Band-Aid on, stitches, right? Stop the bleeding.
Right.
But if there's a bigger issue, right, then you don't get to it when you're in crisis mode. And so sometimes we need to stay beyond crisis mode to look at the deeper work, the deeper issues when our life feels more stable, so we can go through that so that we avoid the crises in the future, if that makes sense.
That makes total sense. I think you're so right. And a couple of things. One, I want to make sure everybody heard, I certainly did, that you can only do so much work, it sounds like, other parts of your life when you're in a crisis, because just like a crisis, you're usually dealing with that thing right in front of you, right? As opposed to what else might be going on, or I should say, and what may have brought about that crisis, if it's something that has to do with, past trauma, as we talked about, or childhood things that are coming up for you that you might not be aware of, or, you always do this thing you're not aware of. So you end up in these crisis situations, not blaming. Not blaming. We're just saying this might be a pattern. I know for me, recognizing patterns of things that I do are very important, certainly in relationships, whether that's work relationships or romantic relationships or family relationships. It's sort of like I'm the only common denominator. So not to have my own therapy session here, but that really resonated with me about the idea of crisis. And just because you've moved beyond the crisis, that's great. But I think, to your point, it's important for everyone to remember, could there be some other work to do at that time? So Yolanda says, I'm in school for my BS, yay, in psychology pre-counseling. However, I have my own business in counseling and I have my associate in ministry. Thank you, Yolanda. We're getting all in your business. I love it. Thank you for sharing. If anyone else has any questions, I'm going to ask just a few more of Dr. Adia. Thank you so much for your time. I'm excited to continue to share this, and I'm excited for people to be able to listen to this maybe with a different or open mind, a different perspective on what to look for in a therapist. I, again, really love the conversation about certainly searching for a Black woman therapist, if that's what's right for you, but then the questions you can ask to find someone who can still speak to you if they don't happen to be a Black therapist. Just because I do feel like a lot of even friends of mine or people that I know who sort of feel stuck because they feel like, well, I can't find a Black man therapist, a Black woman therapist, whatever it is. And these are some questions that'll be helpful. So, question for you. Where do I look? I know you're based in Chicago. I'm in Atlanta. We're doing this live. People are looking, viewing this from all around the world. Where are some of the places that you suggest, not endorsing anybody, but, that you would say I should start if I want to look?
Yeah. So I always recommend the directory on therapyforblackgirls.com. So in that directory, you can search for a Black female therapist in your area. They'll have their insurance listed, their location, so you can see how close or far away they are. So I think that if you're looking for a Black therapist, that is a great place to start. If you're not finding anything there, I also recommend psychologytoday.com. It has a really comprehensive directory where therapists sort of list themselves and put up pictures and all of that and describe, their expertise and insurance and location. So that's another place that you can look, and you can search based on, I have this insurance at this location and I want to focus on anxiety, right? And you can find a therapist in your area that way. So those are sort of the main directories. I know that there are some others. I've sort of seen them in passing. Like, I know there's a Black Chicago therapist directory, and there's probably some directories that are location or city specific. Um, but those are sort of the places that I always recommend that people start.
Mm-hmm.
I think, most therapists will allow you to have like a consultation call, right? Some initial call so you can kind of get a feel for them. You could ask some of these questions that we talked about earlier in those things. So it can be before you schedule that first initial appointment. You could just kind of get a sense of the person, because the initial appointment is, going to be billed to you or billed to your insurance. You're going to be asked a lot of questions about yourself. That's how, most people start, right? Because we want to get to know you. And so you probably want to get a sense of, do you feel comfortable with that person before the initial appointment, so that you're not in the initial appointment sharing all this stuff and feeling like, I don't feel comfortable, right? That's going to be a hard thing.
So
I
is
think,
that something we
well,
ask, like, when we reach out, do you do however many 15-minute or however many consultations before an actual, maybe that's something for people to know, you can ask before you actually make a full
mhm,
appointment. Now, you're not going to get an hour. I
yeah.
would have a whole hour long consultation, but at least you can get some of
No.
your initial questions answered.
Right. Like, could we have a 15-minute call? Right. Do you do consultation calls? Right. I'm sort of looking for a therapist. That's certainly something you could ask for. Yeah. Yeah.
Excellent. Now, what about not? Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Were you going to add
No, go
something
ahead.
else? I was going to say, what about not to get too deep into this, but say I'm someone who, because I know another myth, and we can talk about some of the myths. We want to go over those that some people have is, oh, well, I can't afford it, or my insurance doesn't cover it, so I can't do it, or all these other reasons that might again be valid reasons or circumstantial, but valid nonetheless. What should we do if, say, we don't have insurance, or our therapist that we want isn't within the insurance plan? Are there some other things that you suggest that we take into consideration when facing those hurdles?
Yeah. So I'd say the first thing is that when Obamacare was passed, part of that was the Mental Health Parity Act, which requires health insurance companies to cover mental health care at the same rates that they cover, in the same way that they cover medical care. I
Mhm.
believe that that is still in place. So most insurance will cover some form of therapy. They may not cover family therapy or couples therapy or group therapy, but most insurance will cover individual therapy. Now, you may have a deductible, right? And a deductible means that you have a certain amount that you have to spend out of pocket before the insurance kicks in. And if you have a high deductible plan like $2,000, that means that you have to spend $2,000 out of pocket, which means you have to pay the therapist full fee before the copay kicks in. Most most clients, like most of my clients, basically almost all of them use, I would say 99% of my clients use insurance. Maybe I'll give 95% of my clients use insurance, and most of them have like a $20 copay, right? So if you have insurance and you're searching for a therapist who takes your insurance, your copay should be 20, maybe at most $50 a session, right? So I just encourage you to put that into perspective on around the other things that you might pay for. Like, how much does it cost to get your nails done every 2 weeks? How much do your
That's right.
eyelashes cost?
Right.
Right? We're willing to
You
spend a
look
whole lot
cute
of
and
money
you need to
on a
talk to
whole lot of
someone. So
things, right?
exactly.
Right. But it's like,
Right.
I'll pay $100 for my eyelashes once a month, but a copay of $50 for, it's like,
Right.
interesting, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is, if you do not have insurance, or you feel like I cannot do the deductible, there's often sliding fee scale clinics, right? So I think that more rural areas is probably going to be a little bit more challenging, but uh-oh, I don't know if you lost me or not.
No, you're
Shoot.
still there. We can hear
Can you
you.
hear me?
Hmm.
Uh-oh.
We can hear
Okay.
you.
Am I back?
Yes. You're a little
Okay.
frozen on the video, but I can hear you.
Sorry. So there's usually sliding fee scale clinics. I'm gonna keep talking and let me know if you can hear me. So like I used to oversee a sliding fee scale clinic. It's usually they're associated with a training program. So if there's a master's or a
Mhm.
PhD clinical counseling, marriage and family therapy program, usually their trainees need to get experience doing therapy, and they are supervised by licensed therapists. But like the place that I last worked, our session slid down to $5 a session. And then during the pandemic, we made the sessions free. So often there may be a training clinic associated with a graduate school that does, trains people in counseling or psychology or marriage and family therapy. And so you could search for that. You could search for a community mental health center. So
Mm-hmm.
those options are not as widespread as I would like them to be.
But there are
Um,
options.
but those are options. And I don't know as much about like BetterHelp and some of the online options, but I do think that they tend to have more affordable
Uh-oh, now we
plans.
did
Might
lose.
also be something to look into. Oh shoot.
Okay. They do have
Um,
more affordable.
what I
So
would
you were
say,
talking about BetterHelp, and
like
I've actually used
BetterHelp and
Cerebral.
yes, to sort of look into, because sometimes they'll have texting plans or like one session or something, and it may not be as connected as having your own therapist, but it might offer some support if you can't access some other therapy.
Excellent. So some of the resources, in case you didn't hear, Dr. Dia mentioned BetterHelp. One that I mentioned is betterhelp.com, which is actually a sponsor of the podcast. I should give them a shout out. Getcerebral.com is another one. I think Simone Biles actually just became a spokesperson for them. That's a service that I have used personally. There's Talkspace, which is another online service. So there are a few that are coming out that have been well received and people have used. Either I know, I'm sure you know, but just again, we're just talking about resources, places that you can look for help. Someone from LinkedIn said, thank you so much. This is very helpful. Excellent. Also, excuse me, also something I want to make sure to mention before we go to is that if you work for a company, a lot of companies have, what is it, an EAP? Is it employee?
EAP. Mm-hmm.
Which might be able to refer you to a therapist either or a counselor within your company or tell you where to go to get some support and that kind of thing. So don't be afraid to ask for that as well. I think a lot of us don't think or remember that there's resources that might be readily available for you that you might not even be remembering, even if you're not thinking of it.
Mm-hmm.
So
And,
Sandy
and
said,
some of the major companies, the EAP will cover a certain number of sessions. They might cover six
yeah,
sessions. And so that can be a great way to start.
yes, absolutely. And Sandy, hi, Sandy. Sandy Lawrence says, my church in BK now offers Turning Point mental health services so members can talk and share or also book on their own outside of church. That's excellent. There's probably more. That's a great, great point. There's probably more churches and other institutions, especially, I mean, the COVID, right? Last year, 2020 was just, as we call it, the COVID. It just put us all in a space. If you don't have I won't say if you don't have mental health challenges, but it's understandable. We've been through a lot in
Mm-hmm.
2020. So that's a good point, Sandy. Thank you. Dr. D, is there anything, if you wanted to leave a lasting word with everyone talking about anything, I won't even put any parameters around it. What would be something that you want to make sure we got either from this conversation or something you just want to make sure anyone watching understands about therapy?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe two things. So one of the misconceptions people have about therapy is that it's just talking, right? And there's sort of sometimes you hear like, how's talking going to help? You know?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, yeah, I got a PhD in learning how to talk to people.
Right.
Right? Like that, yeah,
Right.
that was what I trained all those years for.
Right.
And so I think it's important to remember that, when you're working with a licensed therapist, they're trained to listen to you, to bear witness, to hear you, and to offer interventions that are healing, that are growth promoting. So it is more than talking, right? One is that having someone bear witness to you is powerful. We know that in our community. And two is that there are actual interventions that we are trained to offer and to give that make a difference, right? So to know that it's more than just sitting and chatting with someone, it's different than talking to a friend. And the other thing is to remember that taking care of yourself is not selfish. And in fact, it helps you to show up better in the spaces that are important to you, right? It's
Mm,
really hard to show up as you want to show up if you're stressed and you're overwhelmed and you're worn down. It's hard to be the mother you want to be. It's hard to be the daughter you want to be, the sister, the friend, the employee, the boss, right? It's hard to do all of those things when you are worn down and exhausted because you will be irritable, resentful, stressed, all of these things. And so if you take time to take care of yourself, you will be better off, right? One, for yourself, you will be healthier, you will feel better, and you will be able to better show up for the people in your life. And I think remembering that is really important.
Excellent. Dr. Shahara Jackson. Hey, Shahara said, great talk. Thank you both. DeJorn Anderson said, facts. One thing I know, our hour's almost up with Dr. D. Look, you see, I'm trying to get every second in, right? So one last thing I should say, okay, I'll say it's one last thing, but maybe not. I want to make sure to ask you about too, is how do we, oh man, I lost my thought. No, don't go away. It'll come back. It'll come back. Oh, Dr. Adi, I was going to ask you something else. Oh man, it'll come back to me. I'll just have to text her after or something, and then I'll share with you all. It was something. Oh no, I know. Got it. Healthy boundaries. Tell us about the importance of healthy boundaries, because I think what you just, I know, in 7 minutes.
In 7 minutes.
I know. I'm sorry. I just know it's such an important point that you just made about, and I talk about this too, because sometimes, as Black women especially, we need some sort of extrinsic motivation, right? Well, if I'm better, then I can take care of it. If that's what you need, sis, yep. If you're better and you take care of yourself, it'll help you take care of everybody else. Because for a lot of us, that's, what motivates us. It is what it is. It's about our community. But we still need to have healthy boundaries. What? How do we just tell us about it?
So obviously this could be a whole nother talk.
I know. We'll do another session.
And, I like to think about boundaries, healthy boundaries, as creating healthy relationships. I think a lot of times these days people talk about boundaries and they very much simplify it. They say, just say no, or just stop talking to them, or just really, and it, yes, boundaries are that, but it is more complicated and nuanced. And when we say a boundary is just say no, we miss the fact that part of the reason we need healthy boundaries is to create healthy, sustainable relationships. When we don't have healthy boundaries, we are much more likely to feel resentful, frustrated, and to go off on someone because we're pissed that they asked us to do this again, right? And usually what we want is a healthy relationship, right? For those people that you want to stay connected with, boundaries are going to help that. Now, people often don't like when you set new boundaries. I say people tend to throw tantrums. That does not mean the boundary is bad. That does not mean you're mean. It means you have to withstand the tantrum and maintain the boundary in order to create a new dynamic in the relationship, right? So a boundary can look like, I'd be happy to do that for you, but I'm not available at this time, right? Or, if you're welcome to ask me for help, but I need you to give me a day notice in advance, right? I'm not going to be able to just get up and go, right? So there can be boundaries, because if you don't do it, what you find is, the nerve, right? And calling me at this time, asking me to get up at this time. Right. Meanwhile, you're doing it, right? You're doing it. The thing. Exactly. And you could say, I'd love to help you, but I can't in the future. You got to give me a heads up. Yeah. That's a boundary. That's a boundary that allows you to help people. It's not saying I'm never helping you, but it also allows you to protect your peace and your time and your plans, and keeps you from feeling like just because somebody asked me for something, I have to do it. People can ask all they want. That doesn't mean you have to do it. And boundaries say, here's when I will say yes in general, and here's when I will say no, unless you adhere to the boundary.
Yes, thank you. And I think we can. I'm gonna try to see if I can get Dr. Adia back to talk about boundaries, because I do think it's an interesting conversation. And I will just share to close an example for me, especially as someone who's a caregiver, because I think what you said is so important. Sometimes people say just say no. No is a full sentence. All the different sayings we've heard. Okay, like you said, that's true, but there's no, and then there's the nuance, right? We need to write an article about that. But there's also the nuance of the no. So for me, for an example, folks know, if you've listened to me more than 5 minutes, I talk about my parents who are adorable and who crack me up and who are very important in my life. I'm here in Atlanta to be closer to them. They are both in their 90s, thank God. The thing is, what I realized, I'm about 20 minutes away from them. And at first, when I first moved here and away, in my own space, I would go back and forth whenever they called me. If they had a doctor appointment, I'd go back and forth at any time. It was driving me bonkers, which wasn't their fault. They need my help. I know they need my help. It's an obligation that I happily do. But I realized, with the help of my coach, actually, that I had to create a healthy boundary. And I think, again, as caregivers, parents, wives, girl, all the things that we are, these multiple places, this is what helped, to your point, save the relationship, make the
Yes.
relationship less resentful on my part, because they're going to ask. They're going to ask. They need the help. They got to go to the doctor. They got to. So what I did, in short, is create a day. So I go now every Saturday on the weekend for a few hours. I go. I don't bring my laptop. I do have my phone, but I try not to look at my phone. Whatever. It's usually my mom. Whatever she needs that day, whether it's shopping or going through papers or getting stuff together for my aunt who's in a nursing home, or whatever it is, it doesn't matter. That is the day. Those are the hours. Some days it adjusts because of, again, doctor's appointments or things like that. And even with doctor's appointments, I say, here's the times I'm available, because I can't, just go
Mm-hmm.
in. But before, I was like trying to change my schedule around. And then, like you said, then you end up, my mother's always, then you're resistant. She's like, but I asked you if this was okay.
Right.
I'm going to ask,
Mm-hmm.
they're not going to, it's
Right.
up to us to hold the boundary. So I just want to mention that as an example of
Yeah.
how it can help sustain, and even makes it more fun, even for me. Because when I go,
Right.
I know I've carved out this time, not doing anything. It's literally on my calendar. Visit mom and dad a certain number of hours. They know. So anyway, there are ways that we can do it, that it doesn't
Yeah.
have to be confrontational. It can be done in a way of, how can I, for me, I say, how can I be most present during this time I'm with them?
Mm.
I'm not thinking about work. So I just want to share that with you all. Hopefully it's something
I
that's
love
helpful.
that. It's such a good example because you love your parents so much and
Yeah.
you
And you
don't
don't want to.
want to feel resentful and frustrated and irritated when you're with them. The time you have with them is so precious. And so you setting these boundaries allows you to be present and really enjoy this
Exactly. And
precious time that
patient.
you have
Yeah,
with them. Mhm.
exactly.
That's so
Yes.
beautiful.
Excellent. Dr. Adia, oh my goodness. Thank you so much. I can ask you tons of other questions. Thank you, everyone, for jumping in. DeJorn Anderson said, I am in love with these points. How do we navigate? One more question. One more question. It's 2 o'clock. Do you have to go? Do you have another appointment? Can you
No,
get
it's
one more
okay.
question?
I could stay
One more
on.
question. Okay. I am in love with these points. Thank you, DeJorn. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. How do we navigate working with people who may not respect or understand your boundaries?
Yeah, that's challenging, right? So I think that part of it is you have a boundary and then you have a here's what I'm going to do if you don't respect the boundary, right? So we cannot control people, right? We can say, here's what I'd like you to do differently, here's my boundary, and then they get to choose how they respond. If somebody continually disrespects your boundary or pushes past your boundary, then there's got to be something else that you do. So, for example, let's say you have a friend who always wants to gossip about something or always wants to bring up something that's triggering or upsetting, and you say, hey, I don't want to talk about that. And they keep bringing it up. So then what you'll have to do is say, if you continue to bring it up, I'm going to leave the conversation. Right. And
So
so
there
then if
has
they
to be
bring it up again, you'll
consequences.
have to say, okay, I'm not willing to talk about that. Let's end the call or let's end this conversation and we can come back another time. Right. And it may not always be that simple, right? You're asking DeJorn about working with people, right? That becomes more complicated at work because there can be power dynamics, there can be different cultural norms around boundaries. But part of it is you need to clearly communicate the boundary because you can't assume that someone knows your boundary if you don't communicate it. So I would communicate it. If it becomes something that's like harassing or, sort of a violation of your personal space, then you need to talk to a supervisor, you need to talk to HR, right? You need to sort of bring in supports around those boundaries. And so part of the challenge with work is that you're just navigating a lot of different power differentials. But the first thing is to communicate it clearly. And then if they violate the boundary, what behavior can you do to take yourself out of the situation or to change it so that they cannot just continue to push past your boundary and you feel like I just have to take it.
Yes, excellent. And I think to your point, it's so important too to think, to join, and anyone listening or thinking about this, the power dynamics, meaning if it's a boss, a supervisor, or someone who has some sort of control over your career, your position, or even creating a toxic environment for you, you may need to bring in reinforcements or have a conversation with someone who might be able to help you have some sort of reinforcements, whether that's another supervisor or HR. So your boundaries are something, again, that's up to you to either enforce or hold or to make steady, and then look at how you can get support for those if you're in a situation where you feel like you're just not being heard or respected. So thank you so much for that question. And we can ask plenty more. Maybe we will have a boundaries conversation. It looks like that's a conversation that would be helpful. But Dr. Adia, thank you so much for this time, for giving us this time. I so appreciate you. Everyone, we have links to Dr. Adia's website, Dr. Adia Gooden, right? Just your last
Yes.
name.com. Yes, I have the link in the description. So make sure to follow her so you can find out more about her, connect with her on LinkedIn and tell her that you heard this conversation here and you want to know more about her or anything else. Her book is going to come out soon. We'll find out more about that. And I'll make sure that we share the resources that we mention here just so you all can find it. Dr. Adia, thank you so much. Hold on just one second.
Thanks for having me.